Welcome to IPA Encounters. My name is John Roskam. I'm a Senior Fellow at the Institute of Public Affairs. And today, on this episode, I will be talking with Professor Matthew Goodwin. The title of this edition of IPA Encounters is No Left Turn, the Future of Conservatism. And it has been prompted by Matthew's wonderful new book, Values, Voice and Virtue, The New British Politics. A great deal of what Matthew says applies to the UK, of course, is applicable to us here in Australia, which is why we're speaking with Matthew. I am coming to you from the Baillieu Maya Media Studio here in Melbourne at the IPA offices. IPA Encounters is live and exclusive for IPA members. As an IPA member, you have special and privileged access to these conversations. Many IPA members have sent in questions to me, and we're not going to be able to get to all of them, but we'll get to as many as we can. Matthew is one of the most profound new thinkers on politics in the English-speaking world. I have been a subscriber to his Substack now for some time. It is interesting, it is provocative, it is very important writing and discussion. And Matthew has very generously and kindly provided a discount code for those watching to subscribe to his Substack, and we'll be sending you those details and putting them in the program notes. Let me now introduce Matthew. Matthew is a professor of politics at the University of Kent. He's the author of 4 books, including the Sunday Times bestseller, National Populism. He appears regularly in print and the broadcast media. He has often had articles in the Telegraph, the Sunday Times. He's appeared on the BBC on many occasions, and he has advised more than 200 organisations on political issues. As I mentioned, I'm talking with Matthew today because of his new book and because of his profound understanding of the cultural changes and political changes the world is going through at the moment, as we are having a debate about who we are, what our culture is, and what our future might be together as a community. Matthew, welcome to IPA Encounters.
Thank you, John. Thank you. And welcome to everybody who's joining us. It's great to be contributing to this discussion, particularly in Australia. And it's great to be able to discuss some of this research with you.
Congratulations on Values, Voice and Virtue. I very much have enjoyed all your previous books. I think Values, Voice and Virtue is very significant, coming at an important time in the English-speaking world, as what is happening to UK politics and American politics is echoed here in Australia. Can you outline, please, the main arguments of the book, and then we'll talk about each of the 3 components in turn?
Yeah, sure, John, thanks. So it's worth beginning with a brief story about why I decided to write the book in the first place, because as some of your supporters and members will know, Britain, like many other Western democracies over the last decade or so, has had a period of considerable political turbulence. And the way that I see the last 10 years here in Britain is that essentially the country was rocked by 3 different rebellions. We had the rise of populism in the form of Nigel Farage's crusade against Westminster, which was principally about leaving the European Union, lowering immigration, reforming politics. And that really peaked at around 2014, 2015. You then had the second big rebellion, which was the vote for Brexit, where obviously we saw the Leave vote reach 52%. And that, again, was very much a pushback to an elite that many people felt was now out of touch with the rest of the country. And then the third big rebellion was the 2019 political realignment of British politics, where we saw Boris Johnson really tap into many of the same voters who had rallied around Nigel Farage and Brexit. And he obviously won that big 80-seat majority in 2019. He took a big chunk of the Labour Party's territory with him. And we began to talk about the potential long-term realignment of the country, something that I'm sure we'll come back to discuss later on. So the question really that I ask at the outset of this book is what caused these rebellions? What was really driving this upheaval? Because if you look at what we've been told through much of the mainstream media, through much of the public conversation, we've been given a number of narratives that I have simply not found particularly convincing. We've been told that all of this was about social media, it was about big tech, it was about social media firms like Cambridge Analytica, it was about Russia, it was about campaigners like Dominic Cummings, and all of these very short-term factors in the here and now. And I was struck because I spent much of my career working in the academic research and doing studies and surveys myself. And it's always been very clear to me that the events of the last decade, and really the mood that remains with us today, John, is really a reflection of much longer term currents that have been building in British society and Western democracies more generally. And in particular, I think it's really been rooted in a growing sense of despair and disillusionment among millions of voters, in particular working class, non-university educated, older voters, with the way in which a new elite in their respective countries has been imposing a political project on them. And what do I mean by this term, new elite? Really, what I'm arguing is that essentially Britain and Western democracies more generally are seeing an old elite gradually come under competition and in some cases being replaced by this new ruling class of elite graduates from the elite universities who tend to come from privileged backgrounds. Often their parents have also belonged to the graduate class. They tend to live in the big cities, the university towns. They tend to work in the knowledge economy. They're often university professors or lawyers or architects, work in media, public sector. And crucially, over the last 20 years or so, this new elite group, which represents somewhere between 15 and 20% of British society, has been drifting sharply leftwards on cultural issues. So it's been moving to embrace immigration, embrace globalization, embrace gender identity, embrace what we might call woke political correctness, embracing net zero, embracing the increasingly socially liberal view of society and the world. And over the last few decades or so, we've seen this group consolidate its power in a number of ways. We've seen it consolidate its power through geography, by moving into the main epicenters of economic growth and dynamism, by moving into London and the university towns. We've seen it consolidate its power through social networks. The new elite tend to marry other members of the new elite. There's some good work in sociology which shows they tend to live in areas that are also filled with other members of the new elite. They're the least likely to socialize with people from different backgrounds. They've also consolidated their power by doubling down on university education, by expanding the universities. And here in Britain, over the last 40 years, the main beneficiaries of that embrace of mass education have been the children of the new elite, not, for example, white working class kids who have been left behind, but actually the children of the new elite. And they've consolidated their power by silencing those who they disagree with. They are consistently the most politically intolerant group. They're the most likely to unfriend people on social media who they disagree with, to block them on Facebook. We had a great question here in Britain, John, that asked Remainers and Leavers, would you feel comfortable if your son or daughter married somebody from the other side of the political divide? And members of the new elite were consistently the most likely to say they felt uncomfortable about the idea of their children marrying somebody who might have supported Brexit or the Conservative Party. So they are generally more politically intolerant than other groups. And through this process of consolidation, what they've essentially been doing is accumulating more economic, social, and cultural power, and over time have been becoming dominant in many of the institutions in society. And they've really been using that power and influence to impose a particular view of the world that I know we'll come on to discuss when we look at the three aspects of this. But they've come to impose a particular view of the world on millions of other voters who have really begun to see through this new elite and begun to question what they want to do and how they want to transform society. And just before we get into those three parts, I do want to just point out one thing which has come up in some of the reaction to the book. There has always been an elite in British society and Western societies. And I think it's just worth thinking for a second, what is the difference between the old elite and what I'm calling the new elite? The old elite, especially in Britain, were very privileged, economically privileged, were very disconnected from voters in the rest of the country, were often focused on London in the same way. But there is a crucial difference. I think that difference is really around values, that the old elite still ultimately believed in Britain, still ultimately respected the institutions, respected the national culture, respected ways of life, and certainly didn't really derive their social status from rejecting or repudiating those national characteristics. And I think what we've seen over the last 30, 40 years, some people have made this argument over a much longer period of time. In 1972, Daniel Bell, in his work, pointed to the rise of what he called a new adversary class, a new elite that was increasingly deriving status by attacking or repudiating their national culture, identity, and history. And in many ways, what I'm saying in this book, also Chris Lash made a similar argument in 1992. What I'm saying in this book is really that group has simply become much more powerful, has become larger and more dominant in the institutions. So members of that group are increasingly deriving their social status, not from their economic position, not from their money, not from their houses, their estates, or their titles, but they're increasingly deriving status by projecting their socially liberal values, if not their radically woke progressive values. And they're doing that partly by repudiating their national culture, identity, and history in order to try and garner favor among other members of the elite. And that's a crucial difference between the old elite and the new elite, which is why so many voters who are outside of that group, who are from the working class, non-graduate majority, who derive their status from the nation, who have to feel and want to feel that they belong in a community, that source of community is a very important sense of status for them. It's very important, a very important source of esteem and honor for those voters. They're now feeling on a wide range of issues, John, that their worldview, their values that we'll come on and talk about are really now routinely being undermined and eroded if they're not at risk of being lost forever. And that essentially is the core thesis of the book, and we can talk about the three sections of that. But ultimately, it's really taking aim at this new elite and how they're reshaping societies around their interests.
And if we then move on to values, you use a somewhat old-fashioned but important term. The old elite were patriotic. The new elite are not so. Can you talk a little bit about this? Because this is very prevalent here in Australia. The decline in faith in the country, the degradation of our history, the disparagement of our pioneers. This is a relatively new phenomenon that seems to be a trend of the new elites to pursue.
Yeah, so I think fundamentally, the new elite hold a very different set of values to other voters. The first thing to say is they really do not attach as much importance to the nation state as most voters do. They do not view their national identity so much as an important part of who they are. They're much more likely to derive that sense of identity from their achieved identities, from their education, from their profession, maybe from their social networks, and that's a crucial difference. Most voters don't think that way. Most voters believe in the national community. They identify actively with it.
And they're proud of their country.
they're proud of their country, and the new elite increasingly has been moving in a not just a socially liberal direction, but a radical progressive direction or a woke direction, where we can see quite clearly, John, in the survey data that about 15% of Britain, for example, can now be classified as woke, and the way they see the nation is very clear in the data. They're overwhelmingly convinced that Britain is a racist society. They're overwhelmingly convinced that racism is a major social problem. They're overwhelmingly convinced that we cannot move forward as a country unless we address historic injustices that happened hundreds of years ago. They're very suspicious of not just national identity, but the white majority, which they view as being inherently problematic. And so they have a very different view and vision of the nation. And this is one reason why, on all of the more salient policy areas that have emerged in recent years, immigration being perhaps the most obvious example, the new elite has steadily been drifting away from the rest of the country, campaigning for more migration, for looser borders, for a more universal conception of who we are. So I talked, John, about this concept of asymmetrical multiculturalism, which is a bit of a mouthful, but what I mean by that is the new elite increasingly say that the only identities, culture, and history that we are allowed to celebrate are those of minorities, and that we are not allowed to celebrate the identity, history, and culture of the majority. And that is really leaving many people with a sense that their values are no longer respected and recognized within the institutions. And crucially, the argument that we should repackage Britishness, that we should repackage Englishness around a celebration of diversity, for many voters, it seems like it's fine to say we accept diversity, but to make that the main theme of who we are is like saying we do not have an identity of our own. And many voters are now, I think, increasingly skeptical of the way in which their national identity and the story of who we are is openly being repackaged around global themes of universal liberalism, which really have no resonance to the experiences and the values of ordinary people.
If we then move on to the voice, one of the points that you make, a key theme, is that the majority of voters, therefore, in the UK, don't have a voice in this debate. And what strikes me is your analysis that the majority of voters seem to not be represented by either of the two major parties. Their views are not represented in the media or in education or in our cultural or civic institutions. They have no voice. The voice that they hear is not their voice.
Yeah, well, that's absolutely right. If you look at most of the institutions in Britain today, but I think this applies across much of the West, I think if you look at political institutions, media, creative, cultural institutions, universities, they're increasingly dominated by members of this group who come from the same backgrounds, the same life experiences, and hold the same values. I'll give you just one example. If you look at the media class in Britain today, 90% of the media class now have passed through the universities. Half of them have gone to the elite graduate universities. Local media, regional media has collapsed, which means most journalists now go straight from Oxbridge or the Russell Group universities into the newsroom. They often now view themselves as activists rather than neutral, objective observers of the world. And so when you look at the institutions, increasingly what you see, I think, are the way in which they're being used to impose this worldview on other people. And we had a great example of this recently here in Britain with a banking scandal where Nigel Farage, a populist, had his bank account closed essentially because of his political views. And this was really a symbol of what I've been talking about in the book, that as the elite graduate class have drifted leftwards, John, on these identity and cultural questions, they're taking the institutions with them because they tend to dominate those institutions. So this is not a conspiracy. It isn't a kind of, long march through the institutions. What this is what academics often call education polarization. So institutions that are dominated by people who come from the same educational backgrounds, when those people move sharply leftwards on a particular cluster of issues, they will take those organizations and the cultures of those organizations with them. And we can see this also in large parts of the corporate world, where, again, the embrace of diversity, equity, inclusion, the embrace of anti-racism training, the embrace of very dubious concepts like unconscious bias or white privilege. This also reflects this cultural transformation that I'm talking about in the institutions. So millions of people are saying, well, I no longer feel that my voice is present in these institutions. I certainly don't feel that my voice is respected in these institutions. And so they're looking around for alternative forms of politics, however imperfect those vehicles are, whether Brexit or Boris Johnson. And they're really trying to reassert the voice of both themselves and their group in this national conversation and say, look, hang on a minute, I want my values to be in this conversation. I want my preferences to be taken into account in the policy-making process. I want to reassert my view of who we are as a nation and where I want us to go. And I think that's essentially what has been taking place across many democracies over the last decade.
Can I then ask you a specific question about politics in a liberal democracy? Why in the UK, and the same applies largely in Australia and to some extent the US, although it is a little different, why in the UK and Australia are these values of the mainstream of the population not being reflected in the major political parties?
Well, I think there are a few things going on. One is the political class itself has been transformed. If you look at most MPs today, they're no longer coming from relatively diverse backgrounds as they were in the 1950s through to really the 1980s. It wasn't unusual in British politics to have trade unionists, working class MPs, even lots of Labour MPs.
Well, here in Australia, we had a PM who was an engine driver. That would now never occur.
No. And so the political class has been transformed, and the parties have essentially become parties of what Thomas Piketty would call the Brahmin left. They've been taken over by highly educated, often very affluent members of the professional political class. If you look at the House of Commons, John, the largest tribe of MPs in terms of their professional background are what we call political careerists, people who have spent their whole lives in politics. They're now the largest tribe in the House of Commons. The percentage of working class MPs has collapsed to about 1%. There are almost no trade unionists in the House of Commons. There's certainly there's certainly very few people from what we might call ordinary backgrounds. And we've actually done surveys of MPs, and we found that Labour and Conservative MPs are much further to the cultural left than the average voter, and they're closer together than they are to the average voter. So the political class as a whole has essentially moved to the cultural left as it's been transformed. And so there haven't been new vessels that have been able to give people and articulate for people a much stronger a voice. And this is why I'm genuinely concerned about the state of democracy, not just here in Britain, but more generally, because when millions of voters conclude that the political institutions are no longer representative, that representative democracy is no longer what it claims to be, and that they're being excluded from those institutions and from the policy-making process, the answer to that will be what we're seeing in Italy and Spain and France and Germany and elsewhere, which is rising support for national populist parties who will advocate a more direct representation of people's voice in these institutions. So unless they're going to reform, I'm very skeptical as to whether they will, and we'll come back to that, but unless they're going to reform, then I think we will continue to see this escalating political turbulence as people are trying to reassert their voice.
Can I ask you then about the final aspect of your narrative, virtue, and the different ideas of virtue that the elite has from the rest of the population?
Yeah, so I think if you look at the way in which we allocate status in society is changing. And, as a political scientist, I would say people in my world are pretty rubbish at thinking through social status. We tend to look at just voting and institutions, but there's something interesting going on in society today because, if you go back in time, really, people derive their sense of status from maybe their job, maybe their sort of sense of achievement, maybe their membership of the national community, their contribution to that national community, maybe their family. What we're seeing today, I'm arguing here, John, is the rise of a new hierarchy in society, a new way of distributing status, where essentially if you are a member of a minority group, a racial, sexual, gender minority, or a member of the new elite, the new white graduate elite who now describes itself as an ally of minorities, using language that is quite warlike, describing people as allies, then you are high status. You are worthy of social esteem. You're worthy of honor. But if you are unlucky enough to belong to the white majority, to the non-graduate majority, to the white working class, if you are considered to have a problematic identity in some way, then you are low status. You are at the bottom of this new social ladder. And we can see this in many different ways in society. One of them that I point to in the Substack regularly is the extent to which things like critical race theory are now sweeping through Britain's primary and secondary schools, where children have been and are being taught that they should essentially apologize for their inherited racial guilt, that they should recognize their whiteness, and that they should reflect on their white privilege. We've had a number of studies now that have shown how widespread these ideologies are becoming within Britain's institutions. And so the new elite is increasingly deriving its sense of status, its sense of moral righteousness over others, by embracing these luxury beliefs, these beliefs which allow them to accrue more status from other members of the elite, while looking down on the masses around them as morally inferior, as ignorant, as lemmings, as the deplorables, as little Englanders. And we saw this in Britain, especially, John, in the aftermath of the Brexit referendum, which is when certainly my personal political views began to change. Prior to the Brexit referendum, I was, fairly comfortable working in the universities. I was pretty relaxed with where the country was. In the 4 or 5 years after the Brexit referendum, as I saw this outburst of open hostility and class prejudice toward millions of people, many of whom I'd grown up with, I really began to reassess how I see the country and how I see the people who are running the country. It was a very ugly moment in British politics, and one that really reflected a form of prejudice, John, that would never have been allowed to take place were it involving any minority group. But because it was focused on mainly working class Brexit voters, it was considered to be somehow acceptable in Westminster. And that really changed my view of the country and our politics.
You've written powerfully about your family background, and it might be called working class, it might be called something else, your family situation. How are you treated by your colleagues? How are you treated by the MPs that you regularly brief? Because I don't know whether people would necessarily call you a conservative. I don't know whether you'd call yourself a conservative, but you're certainly identifying things that I think are true and accurate, but which are deeply uncomfortable to many, many people.
I think what we've seen over particularly the last 10 years or so, has been a narrowing of the public square, kind of narrowing of what is considered acceptable debate in this country and many others. I mean, if you look at the survey data, John, about 60% of Brits now say they feel they cannot say what they want to say because they're worried about what will happen to them if they do. They're fearful of the consequences. I think a lot of people are sick of that orthodoxy. I've certainly, my relationship with colleagues in universities has changed because I was one of about 10% of academics in Britain who publicly accepted the Brexit vote. In the aftermath, I said I just felt like we should implement the vote for Brexit. That's what people voted for. I didn't campaign for Brexit, but I certainly respected the result, and that in itself was enough to really cause quite a lot of problems within the university. And then, as we saw a number of high-profile academics being harassed and in some cases being dismissed or sacked from university, Kathleen Stock being the most obvious example, but Jordan Peterson perhaps being another when his offer of a fellowship at Cambridge was rescinded. I was then heavily involved in a campaign to bring about a new law here in Britain to defend academic freedom and free speech in the universities, which of course made me even more unpopular among my colleagues. But now, as a result of that law, John, if, for example, I were harassed or discriminated against because of my political views in a university, I would now have recourse to an external regulator, essentially, who would be able to intervene on my behalf and in essence allow me to sue my university, which wasn't possible before. And we felt that we had to do that in the aftermath of Brexit and everything that was happening amid the so-called culture wars, because if you are a contrarian, if you are a nonconformist or a part of the minority on campus, the simple reality, John, is it is often not a pleasant place to be.
Can I then ask you? You mentioned two important things that I'd like to talk about: culture wars and what they are, and I'll ask you about that after I ask you about the question: are we now, and I'll say we, people who have, let's say, traditional views of liberal democracy, commitment to freedom of speech, equality of citizenship, the idea that we're judged not according to our race, or gender, or class, or colour of our skin. Are we now in a minority? And so people like Joel Kotkin, Toby Young have talked about this as the new heresy, us as dissidents. Do we need to change our mindset to understand that we are now the counter-revolutionaries? We are not in the mainstream. We are not in the majority, at least in elite institutions. And therefore, going forward, how we think about the changes to what we do, we need to reassess our role and how we think of ourselves.
I think that's a very fair point, actually. One of the things I often say to people is, if you look at the so-called culture war questions, for people who hold views like we should lower immigration, we should push back against gender identity, we shouldn't become obsessed with what happened centuries ago. These are all majority positions out there in the country. We had a great example of this in Scotland recently, where the Scottish National Party pushed quite hard to allow 16-year-olds to legally change their gender. And when voters tuned into it, only 20% supported it and 80% opposed it. If you look at immigration, about 75% of the country want to reduce it. They don't want to increase it. So most people don't think like the new elite. The problem is the new elite, as I say, dominate many of the institutions. So we are a minority. If you hold those views and share those views, we are a minority within the institutions. So what does that mean? And I think, there are two parallel conversations going on in the West at the moment. One is, how do you build new movements that better represent people's values and their voice? And how do you represent and how do you build new movements that can capitalize on the failures of the old parties? And that's why I think we're seeing the rise of populism.
So just before that, can I ask you, so you're assuming new movements have to be built. Does that mean the current institutions are beyond redemption, are beyond recapture?
Well, yeah. So one conversation is, can there be new movements that better articulate people's values and voice? But the second, which comes to this point about the institutions, is, can we build a new counter elite? Can we actually build a counter elite that is both more in touch with the country and willing to try and rebalance the institutions? And there are a few examples of this taking place. I mean, if you look at the US, take the universities as an example, what Ron DeSantis has been trying to do in Florida, the rise of independent parallel universities, trying to provide an alternative outlet for people who might be wanting to have a different university experience. I think if you look at some of the ways in which sort of civic society organizations have been trying to cultivate a new generation of elites who perhaps accept that the institutions have lost their way. We've also got donors who I think are doing some really interesting work at trying to shake up and diversify the institutions. Here in Britain, we've had two new media organizations in the last 5 years, GB News and Talk TV, which have both tried to change the public square and the national conversation in a way that's more in touch with people in the wider country. So there are things that are happening, but to me, I think it's critical that we make this distinction between, there are mass movements which sometimes take a very long time to get going and to bring about change, and then there is I think the more urgent, pressing need to develop a counter elite, and to ensure that that counter elite is supported and funded and organized, and can work at rebalancing some of these institutions. Because I'm worried, John, if we don't reform the institutions so that they give people a better sense that they have a voice, then I think we are going to increasingly see what America has seen, which is escalating polarization around the institutions. Just one quick example. Look at what happened last month with the universities in America. Public confidence in the Gallup polling, which is the most reputed pollster in America, public confidence fell to a record low, especially among Republicans, who are now saying, well, I'm not going to send my kids to college and to university because I don't trust the institutions anymore. I think they're being politicized. That is what is going to increasingly happen across media, across politics, across universities, if we don't reform the institutions and make them more representative.
Can I then ask you about culture and culture wars? So it's a phrase, a term used a lot here in Australia, as I know it is in the UK. And I'd like to ask you a specific question about the political parties. It's often heard on the conservative side of politics of the Liberal National parties that they shouldn't fight the culture wars. Conservative parties should stick to economics. What's your view?
I completely disagree with that. Look, first of all, the fact that conservatives are even using the language of culture wars reflects just how weak they've become, right? So what essentially has happened is a whole swathe of traditional conservative territory, from family rights to immigration to national identity, have been repackaged as toxic, socially unacceptable culture wars. So there's a language game that's going on here, and I think conservatives are losing badly at that game. The second thing that I would say is, if you look at most of these culture war questions, they're not 50-50, John. They don't break 50-50. They break typically 70-30 against the new elite, or in some cases 80-20. So I'll give you a real world example. Actually, in my spare time, I do a lot of polling, and we polled people recently. We said, to what extent do you think pregnant women should be renamed? So we should remove the reference to women, and we should refer to pregnant persons. That's a 5% position, right? 5% of voters thought that was a good idea, right? And I could give you many other examples, from net zero through to immigration. Here's the problem, John. We have a generation of conservatives who are status conscious, who are too anxious to get involved in these issues. They often view them as being beneath them, as low status political games. They're much more focused on the economy, or in Britain, they've been influenced by the legacy of Thatcherism. So they're fundamentally focused on taxation and the economy. And they've really lost sight of the way in which culture has become much more important to politics. Now, the conservatives who have been targeting these issues, whether Donald Trump or Giorgia Meloni or Marine Le Pen or the Sweden Democrats, when they have targeted these issues and increased the salience of these issues, they've typically benefited. They've increased their support among working class voters. They've increased their support among older voters, including, by the way, non-white working class voters. There's a reason why Hispanic and Latino voters in America are moving very quickly towards the Republicans, because they think that a lot of the culture stuff is crazy, what's going on in the US. And so what we need, I think, is a generation of conservatives, John, who understand that the nature of conservatism has to change, that the rules of politics have fundamentally changed, and that we're no longer in the 20th century. The left-right grid is no longer as valid as it used to be. We need a different brand of conservative politics. And whoever acknowledges that and adapts to that and exploits that will be very successful.
And watching Brexit here in Australia, so many of the elite commentariat were surprised when they felt that people were voting against their economic self-interest on cultural grounds for the UK to be self-governing. We've seen examples of how the elites keep on trying to change the debate.
Well, I think Brexit was very traumatic for the new elite, firstly, because they'd never really lost before. Um, they didn't, they woke up on the day after the referendum and felt that people had imposed another set of values on them, which is exactly what millions of voters have felt for the last 30, 40 years. And I think many people in the new elite really struggled with Brexit and what it represented. And in particular, they struggled with the reassertion of popular sovereignty because they'd become used to this notion of a more elitist conception of democracy that was really focused on the relationship, the horizontal relationship between different elites in the EU and the UK, rather than the vertical relationship between elites and voters. And so Brexit was really a reminder that popular sovereignty really does pack a punch, and that voters out there in the country do think very differently on many issues.
And culture counts.
From the people in power. And culture counts. And, if you look at one of the points I make in the book is, if you look at all of the research on the Brexit vote, it is remarkably consistent. It says that people voted for Brexit for two reasons. They wanted to reclaim national sovereignty and live in an independent, sovereign, self-governing nation which makes decisions for itself, and those decisions are not influenced by anybody else. And the second reason was they wanted to lower immigration. Those were consistently the two most significant drivers of Brexit. But over the last 7 years or so, we've just seen members of the ruling class fall over themselves to try and deny all of that, to try and say that, well, actually, this was about, something completely different. And those two requests, I think, were perfectly acceptable. There were lots of good reasons, I think, why people were skeptical of the European Union. It isn't a dynamic organization. It isn't sufficiently democratic. It isn't transparent. It is diverging. It is not particularly open to things like free speech and a diversity of thought. And voters, I think, saw through that. So popular sovereignty really was the key part of that Brexit vote, and is why so many voters, John, in Britain today still feel utterly despondent and disillusioned, because that moment was supposed to usher in a different political revolution. It was supposed to bring politics back closer to the people. It was supposed to bring Westminster back closer to the people. But it's actually done the opposite. It's not produced that effect. And so I think we're now in an interregnum. I think we are simply waiting for whatever is going to come next.
Can I ask you another political question? It's a question that many of our members have asked me to ask you. It's about young people. How do centre-right political parties within the UK or Australia, around the English-speaking world, respond to the view that as the population gets younger and young people are predominantly of the centre-left or further left, that therefore centre-right parties have to follow young people and their vote? How do Conservatives speak to young people?
I mean, I think firstly, they do need to think about that issue very carefully, because if you look at the latest data, to give you one stat here in Britain, about 80% of 18 to 24-year-old Zoomers from Gen Z are planning to vote for liberal left parties, Labour, the Greens, the Liberal Democrats, the SNP. And actually, if you look at young university-educated women, John, they are increasingly drifting leftwards culturally and politically. I mean, about 85% of that group are planning to vote for the Labour Party. So there is a generational challenge for the Conservatives. But what I would say, firstly, is that in terms of the next election cycle, and I think the next one or two elections, there is, I think, a need to think beyond that demographic. Because if you look at where young graduates concentrate, they're in the cities with the new elite. The reason Brexit was able to get over the line, the reason Boris Johnson did so well, is because under our majoritarian first past the post system, if you tap into this angry, frustrated coalition, it basically dominates the political geography. It represents about 65, 70% of all seats. So you don't actually need the 18 to 24s to win an election, and they are about 30 points less likely to vote than the over 50s. So my question would be, how do you assemble a coalition that will get you through the 2020s while you can do some of the things you need to do in order to peel back support among that group, whether that's trying to fix the housing crisis, whether it's trying to speak to those voters about having a better stake in capitalism?
Can you talk a little bit about that, how to speak to young people into the medium and long term about freedom, about values, about capitalism, about markets?
Yeah, well, I'll give you, I mean, one of the challenges that we've got, and I'm sure you've got it too in Australia, is many young people are now absolutely convinced the future will be worse than the present, and the present is already worse than the past, and they're going to have a much more difficult experience than their predecessors had because of, in particular, the spiraling cost of housing, which is an enormous issue among young people here in Britain, and the dawning realization that actually it's not impossible, but incredibly unlikely that they are going to get onto the housing ladder anytime soon. And that's predominantly because of two issues. One is planning. We need politicians and leaders who are much better at removing obstacles to building more houses. And the other is immigration. We have enormous demand for both rented and owned housing in this country now because we're running net migration at 600,000 a year. And to give you one stat, Britain built 200,000 homes last year, right, which is not even coming close to fixing the housing crisis that we have. But if we maintain the current levels of immigration, John, we're going to need to build 620,000 houses every year for the foreseeable future just to manage the demand from ongoing migration before you get to the demand from British people. So there is an opportunity in speaking to people about these issues in a much more interconnected way, in trying to urge them to think about the need to prioritize members of the national community above others while we can deal with this issue. And I think just beyond the housing, John, the other thing that I would say is I think increasingly young people are very disillusioned with the realization that simply passing through the universities is not necessarily going to get them a passport to a better life. About 1/3 of jobs that graduates in Britain end up doing don't require a university degree. But we built up this university meritocracy, which views having a degree as the only definition of leading a successful life. And we need to do much better at telling kids that actually, they can go into the trades, or they can go into vocational training or apprenticeships or whatever, and they can still lead a valuable, successful life. They don't necessarily need to pass through the universities to do that. And we've sort of let them down in that sphere as well.
Can I dig a bit deeper? And you've written a lot about this. Not only have we let them down economically, but, and I'm not sure whether you've used these terms, we've let them down spiritually. We've let them down philosophically. We are inculcating them in a culture that is deeply nihilistic, that is negative, and that is, for many of them, beyond redemption, it seems. How does that change as we have a generation of young people, especially after lockdowns in the UK and Australia, who have a deeply and not ill-founded pessimistic view of the world and of their future as humans and individuals?
I know. I think you're right to point to that. I think if you look at, it's not only a nihilistic culture, it's a very narcissistic one too. And it's very clear looking at the evidence on social media and smartphones too, that we are raising a generation of children and young people who are being exposed to a culture that is not just narcissistic, but also anchored around this notion of victimhood as well.
The sociologist.
Well, the sociologists Campbell and Manning have talked about the way in which we've moved from a culture of honor and bravery to a culture of victimhood, which really incentivizes young people to view themselves in a way that is not conducive to having a sense of agency or a sense of responsibility over their own lives. And I think we need to really focus on rebuilding that. And this is why I talk endlessly about the institutions, because the prevailing culture that we are cultivating is really one that is designed by this new elite in the interests of this new elite, and is not really serving young people well at all. We're not talking about things like responsibility and obligation in the way that we once did. We're talking principally about rights, about what people have a right to, which I think was partly encouraged here in Britain by the legacy of the New Labour years. And I think we've lost a sense of civic obligation and community. And young people, Gen Z as well, have come of age amid a very, very difficult time. They've gone through a succession of crises. And I think, to be frank, they're also right to be skeptical of the expert class in its ability to solve their problems, because this is the generation of the financial crisis. It's the generation of COVID. It's the generation of Syria, of Afghanistan. It's a generation of climate. It's a generation of watching an elite class really fumble its way through a succession of crises. I mean, so, I think they're right to be skeptical of where we are as well.
In the remaining minutes that we have left, I'd like to ask you about how this political situation might resolve itself into the medium term. You've written about the potential of new political parties to emerge. We've spoken about new institutions emerging. What's your prognosis over the medium term for how these developments might play out?
So I think the first thing to say is we are seeing the continued rise of anti-establishment movements in most democracies. And so when I wrote my previous book, National Populism, I did argue that these movements were just going to keep getting more and more popular. And you've seen that, and I think we've got two big elections next year. We've got the US, with this question mark over Donald Trump and what happens there. We've also got the UK, where I think we'll see the Conservatives really lose a lot of support among many of the people that Boris Johnson rallied in 2019. And I think those are going to be instructive elections for helping us navigate where things are going. My big concern is what we'll see in the UK is mass apathy, that we'll just simply see many of the people that rallied around those big three revolts simply give up on the political system until something else turns up. And there is an active conversation in Britain. I wrote a piece on the Substack last week about, this growing number of people that are calling for a new political movement, a new political party. So I think that's quite interesting and should be something to watch. But elsewhere, I think, probably where we're going is really the parties that were founded to represent voters in the 20th century, that were formed in the aftermath of the Industrial Revolution, that were formed around the economic axis of politics. The parties that fail to understand that we're now in a two-dimensional space where culture matters as much to voters as economics, I think those parties will increasingly disappear and be replaced by new entrepreneurs, by new political players who grasp the fact that many voters really do think very differently from this new elite and want a very different kind of society built for them in the future. So it's not a pessimistic prognosis at all. It's simply saying that, I think we're going to see, as in France, as in Italy, as in Sweden, as in America, we're going to see the rise of new players who are going to speak to the divides that I talk about in the book, the divides over values, the divides over a loss of voice, and the divides over a sense of who has status, who is respected, and who is not.
Have you seen historical parallels to what's occurring now in the 2020s?
I mean, the obvious example in terms of some of the immediate politics of today, especially in Britain, would be the 1970s, where, obviously we've gone through a very similar political battle in many ways. I mean, we had similar economic conditions, we had industrial disputes, inflation, but I think more generally we had a sense that nobody had the answers. Nobody had a story and a narrative that was capable of inspiring people. And of course, one of the things about stagnation and decline is it tends to pave the way for new leaders. And obviously that in that case, we had Thatcher, and she had a very particular set of answers to a very different set of questions. And she was able to inspire the masses to rally around that particular project. I think what's seeping into a lot of people today, I think if you spent time in Westminster, where I'm just going after this call, I think people would say, yes, there are some parallels with the 70s, but we can't see the new Thatcher. We can't see the new leader. We can't see the new vision of where we're going. There's an acceptance that Rishi Sunak is not inspiring a country. There's an acceptance that the Labour leader, Keir Starmer, is not particularly inspiring. There's an acceptance that Labour and the Conservatives look quite lost when confronted with the big challenges around productivity and China, woke progressivism, mass immigration, globalisation. There's a sense that this new consensus between left and right is not inspiring the nation. So I think, you know, it's whether or not somebody is going to emerge and step into that vacuum and speak to that concern. And if they do, I suspect they'll find a very receptive audience.
Can I then ask a final question, Matthew? Are you optimistic for the future?
I mean, I think it's, I think I'm optimistic in the sense that the events of the last decade, I think, have underlined to all of us the way in which there is a very big gulf between the people who are running our societies and the people who are living in them. And I think we can now all accept that that gulf is unavoidable, that it's there, and that it needs to be dealt with. And I think that alone is helpful. You know, that I think it's impossible for those in power to deny that they are out of touch with the rest of the country on a number of issues. But at the same time, John, I'm very skeptical about what form of politics is going to emerge in the future, given everything we've talked about. So I'm a glass is half full, half empty kind of guy.
Matthew, thank you so much for your time today. Congratulations on Values, Voice and Virtue, the new British politics. Thank you for being with us today on IPA Encounters.
Thanks for your time, John, and thanks to everybody for joining.